Welcome back to Dr. Finance. This is a paper written by Franco Modigliani, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1985. This is what he published in Econometrica in 1944, titled Liquidity Preference and the Theory of Interest and Money. Part 1, Introduction. The aim of this paper is to reconsider critically some of the most important old and recent theories of the rate of interest and money, and to formulate eventually a more general theory that will take into account the vital contributions of each analysis as well as the part played by different basic hypotheses. The analysis will proceed according to the following plan. 1. We start out by briefly re-examining the Keynesian theory. In so doing, our principal aim is to determine what is the part played in the Keynesian system by the liquidity preference on the one hand, and by the very special assumptions about the supply of labor on the other. This will permit us to distinguish those results that are due to a real improvement of analysis from conclusions that depend on the difference of basic assumptions. 2. We then proceed to consider the properties of systems in which one or both Keynesian hypotheses are abandoned. We thus check our previous results and test the logical consistency of the classical theory of money and the dichotomy of real and monetary economics. 3. From this analysis will gradually emerge our general theory of the rate of interest and money. And we can proceed to use this theory to test critically some recent Keynesian theories, and more especially those formulated by Hicks and Value and Capital, and by Lerner in several articles. Finally, to make clear the conclusions that follow from the theory, we take issue in the controversial question as to whether the rate of interest is determined by real or by monetary factors. In order to simplify the task, our analysis proceeds in general under static assumptions. This does not mean that we neglect time, but only that we assume that Hicksian total elasticity of expectation to be always unity. In Hicks' own words, this means that a change in current prices will change expected prices in the same direction and in the same proportion, as shown by Oscar Lange. This implies that we assume the expectation functions connecting expected with present prices to be homogeneous of the first degree. Since all the theories we examine or formulate in this paper are concerned with the determinants of equilibrium and not with the explanation of business cycles, the simplification, although it is serious in some respects, does not seem unwarranted. Conclusions: saving and investment or supply of and demand for cash. It will now be useful in concluding this paper to restate in brief form the general theory of interest and money that emerges from our analysis. We believe that the best way of achieving this aim is to show how, by means of our theory, we can answer the controversial question that has caused so much discussion in recent economic literature. Is the rate of interest determined by the demand for and supply of cash? Or is it determined by those real factors, psychological and technological, that can be subsumed under the concepts of propensity to save and marginal efficiency of investment? We consider it to be a distinct advantage of our theory that we can answer both questions affirmatively. We do not have to choose between these two alternatives any more than between the following two. If the price of fish determined by the daily demand and the daily supply, or is the price of fish determined by the daily demand and the daily supply, or is it determined by the average yearly demand and the cost of fishing? Since we have maintained throughout this paper that in general, saving and lending are independent decisions, we must clearly agree that the daily rate of interest is determined by the demand for and supply of money to hold, or for that matter, by demand and for supply of loanable funds. It is this very principle that has formed the base of our analysis of the money market. But we cannot stop at this recognition and think that this is sufficient for a general theory of the rate of interest. To come back to our example, it is certainly true that the daily price of fish is entirely explained by the daily catch of fish. But if we want to understand why the daily price fluctuates around a certain level and not around a level 10 times as high, we must look for something more fundamental than the good or bad luck of the fisherman on a particular day. We shall then discover that the number of fishermen and the amount of equipment used does not change daily, but is determined by the condition that the average returns through good and bad days must be sufficiently high to make the occupation of fishing and investment in fishing equipment as attractive as alternative ones. What is obviously true for the price of fish must also hold for the price of loans. The statement that the daily rate is determined by the daily demand for and supply of money, or more exactly, of money to hold, does not greatly advance us in the understanding of the true determinants of the rate of interest. This theory, by itself, is insufficient to explain, for instance, why in countries well equipped and of great saving capacity, like England or in the United States, the system of rates of interest fluctuates around low levels, 2 or 3% for the pure long rate and much less for short rates, while it fluctuates around much higher levels, 5 or 6% or more for the long rate in countries poor in savings or rich but scarcely developed. Is that because in the last mentioned countries the supply of cash is insufficient? Clearly not. The explanation for this difference can only run in terms of those more fundamental factors, technological and psychological, that are included in the propensity to save and the marginal efficiency of investment. As we have shown in our model, the equality of demand and supply of loanable funds is the equilibrium condition for the week or for our income period, and determines the equilibrium rate of interest or system of rates for the week. It corresponds to the short-run equilibrium condition of the Marshallian demand and supply analysis. Price equals marginal cost, but the stock of money to hold the supply tends itself to change and thus push the daily rate toward the level at which the flow of money saving equals the flow of money investment. the condition ex ante saving equals ex ante investment corresponds to the long-run Marshallian condition under perfect competition. Price equals to average cost including rent. The first condition is satisfied even in the short period, since it is the result of decisions that can be carried out instantaneously. The second is a long-run condition and therefore may actually never be satisfied, but it is necessary to explain the level towards which the weekly rate tends. Even though this level may never be reached, since the long-run equilibrium rate of interest itself changes. Thus, to complete our theory, we must be able to explain what determines the level of long-run equilibrium. At this point, we find that our answer is not unique, since it depends on the assumptions concerning the form of the supply of labor schedule. 1. As long as wages are flexible, the long-run equilibrium rate of interest is determined exclusively by real factors, that is to say, essentially by the propensity to save and the marginal efficiency of investment. The condition money saving being equal to money investment determines the price level and not the rate of interest. Number 2, if wages are rigid, it is still true that the long-run equilibrium rate of interest is determined by the propensities to save and to invest, but the situation is now more complicated, for these propensities depend also on money income and therefore on the quantity of active money, which in turn depends itself on the level of the rate of interest. Thus, unless wages are perfectly flexible or the supply of money is always so adjusted as to assure the maintenance of full employment, the long-run equilibrium rate of interest depends also on the quantity of money, and it is determined together with money income by equations 1, 2, and 3 of our model. We want, however, to stress again that the dependence of the rate of interest on the quantity of money does not depend on liquidity preference. In a system with rigid wages, not only interest, but also almost every economic variable depends on the quantity of money. Number 3, finally, our theory of the rate of interest becomes even less uniform when we take into account the Keynesian case. In this case, clearly, the long-run equilibrium rate of interest is the rate which makes the demand for money to hold infinitely elastic. The economic theorist here is forced to recognize that under certain conditions, the rate of interest is determined exclusively by institutional factors. Thanks for listening.